was a mild November afternoon in 1997, the kind of day where the last autumn leaves clung to the trees and the air felt heavy with the coming dark. In the quiet suburb of Exwick, just outside Exeter in Devon, the streets were calm, families finishing tea, and children still out making the most of the weekend. At 4:30 p.m., Kate Bushell, a bright and well-liked 14-year-old schoolgirl, zipped up her fleece, called out to her parents, and set off down the road. She was doing a simple favor, walking Gemma, the neighbor's Jack Russell Terrier, along a short familiar route on Exwick Lane, a narrow rural stretch lined with hedges and quiet farmland. Kate wasn't the kind of girl to wander off. She was conscientious, smart, and mature beyond her years. She loved books, was thoughtful with her friends, and wasn't one to take risks. That's what made what came next all the more devastating. By 5 p.m., the sun had slipped behind the hills. The streetlights hadn't come on yet, but darkness was already moving in. And when Gemma, the small white dog, returned to her owner's house alone, panting and skittish, Kate's parents were alerted immediately. Her father, Graham, didn't wait. He went straight out into the fading light, retracing his daughter's usual path along Exwick Lane. It wasn't far, just a 10-minute walk at most, but time stretched unbearably thin as he searched through the hedgerows and across the isolated fields. And then he saw her. Just off the narrow lane, at the edge of a field near a wooden stile, lay Kate. She was motionless, still. Her throat had been slashed with a precision that was both violent and calculated. The blade used was at least 6 inches long. Police would later suggest it may have been a knife of the kind used in hunting or by tradesmen. The attack had been swift. She had no time to scream. There were no defensive wounds. No one had heard a thing. She died alone, on the cold ground, just a few hundred feet from safety. Graham Bushell fell to his knees. His daughter, his little girl, had been murdered in broad daylight, on a country lane just minutes from home. The peaceful quiet of Devon had been shattered. The story of Kate Bushell would become one of the most haunting cold cases in British history. But in that first hour, nothing was certain, except one thing. Kate hadn't just gone for a walk. She had walked straight into the path of a killer. The sirens broke the silence first. Moments after Graham Bushell made the discovery, his cry for help echoed across the farmland, carried on the wind, and up through the sleepy lanes of Exwick. A neighbor ran to a phone. Within minutes, patrol cars arrived, blue lights flashing in the growing darkness. Officers cordoned off the field. Paramedics approached, but it was already too late. There was no hope, no resuscitation, just the dreadful certainty that a child had been murdered. Kate was found lying in the grass, close to a well-worn footpath leading from the lane. Her fleece was stained with blood. The dog's lead was still nearby, trailing slightly in the mud. Her body, partially obscured by the long grass, looked as though she had simply fallen, peaceful, except for the devastating wound to her neck. A senior officer from the Devon and Cornwall Police arrived on the scene and took one look before stepping back, quiet. He knew. This wasn't a tragic accident or a random injury. This was something far worse. Someone had attacked a 14-year-old girl with a knife, and they had done it in near silence, just off a public path on a Saturday afternoon. As news filtered through the streets of Exwick, people emerged from their homes, clutching coats and torches, trying to understand what had happened. Some thought there had been a car accident. Others assumed an elderly walker had fallen. But when they saw the crime scene tape going up, when they heard that a young girl had been found dead, fear began to take root. The Bushell home was quickly surrounded by officers, not out of suspicion, but to protect the family. A detective sat with Kate's mother, Suzanne, who had been waiting at the window for her daughter to return home with the dog. She couldn't understand why the dog had come back without her. She'd stared out the window for almost 40 minutes before the knock at the door came. In her living room, she was told the unthinkable. Kate had been murdered. Her brother Tim, who was just a few years older, stood frozen in the hallway, unable to process what had happened. The image of that moment, Suzanne sobbing, Graham still out in the field, Tim silent in disbelief, would remain burned into the memories of every officer who walked into that house that night. Meanwhile, in the field, the scene became a hive of activity. Forensics officers began their slow, methodical sweep. They marked the position of the body, they collected soil samples, they examined the surrounding hedgerows and stiles. Every footprint, every blade of grass disturbed, every speck of clothing preserved, because something had happened there, something deliberate, and someone had done this. The chilling reality began to settle in. A murderer had walked among them. And the fields of Exwick Lane, so familiar and safe, had become a hunting ground. But this wasn't just a crime. It was personal. And the search for justice, for answers, was about to consume an entire community. Exwick Lane was now a crime scene, a narrow, hedge-lined strip of tarmac transformed by high-vis jackets, floodlights, and silence. The kind of silence that sits heavy in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. Within hours, 100-meter cordon was in place. Police tape fluttered in the breeze. Officers in boots and gloves combed the verge line by line. The field where Kate had died, so ordinary, so open, now looked different, tainted. The grass where her body had been found was marked with stakes and string. Evidence flags dotted the path. Somewhere in that patch of countryside her killer had walked, maybe run, maybe waited. Locals stood at the edge of the tape, whispering. A few had seen the ambulances, the rush of police cars, but it wasn't until the late news broadcast that night that the truth began to echo across Devon. A 14-year-old girl has been found murdered in a field on the outskirts of Exeter. Police are treating her death as suspicious. That word, suspicious, didn't even come close. By Sunday morning, word had spread like wildfire. Parents kept their children indoors, dog walkers took new routes. School friends of Kate's were stunned, some too scared to sleep, others unable to speak through their tears. She had just been there, just yesterday, laughing in class, smiling as she zipped up her jacket. Now she was a photograph on the front page. Detectives from the major crime unit arrived before dawn. Every available officer in the region was called in. Exwick Lane was sealed off indefinitely. By Monday, uniformed officers were going door to door across the community. No one was spared. Every house, every flat, every garden shed scrutinized. Everyone was a potential witness. And worse, everyone was a potential suspect. One officer would later describe it as the most unnerving investigation of his career, not because of the brutality, but because it happened so quickly, so cleanly, so quietly. There had been no scream, no fight, no alert. Whoever did this had struck with lethal intent and slipped away in daylight. That meant one thing: planning. Then came the early witness accounts. A couple reported seeing a small blue car parked near a lay-by on Exwick Lane around the time of Kate's walk. A mother and daughter out driving also noticed a man standing next to the vehicle, acting strangely. Another man, jogging or running, had been seen further along the lane, his appearance disheveled, possibly with red marks on his hands. Descriptions began to form. A white male, possibly in his 30s or 40s, average build, dark collar-length hair, seen alone in an area that rarely attracted strangers. Sketches were drawn. Appeals were drafted. But no one knew the man's name. No one recognized the car. And worse, he had vanished without leaving a single clear footprint. And so the people of Exeter locked their doors. The autumn wind swept through the trees, and the field at Exwick Lane became a symbol of fear. What was once a path used for Sunday strolls and dog walks had turned into something else, something whispered about behind closed curtains. a man seen near the lay-by, another spotted hurrying down a narrow footpath. Witness statements came in piecemeal, but one name kept surfacing among investigators behind closed doors: the Running Man. He wasn't a myth. Several people saw him that evening, Saturday, November 15, 1997, in the critical window between 4:45 and 5:30 p.m. One witness, a young couple walking back from the shops, spotted a man bolting down a rural path that connected to Exwick Lane. They said he was sweating heavily, red in the face, with his head down, avoiding eye contact. Then came a second report from a driver who passed a similar figure around the same time. This one was near a hedgerow, walking fast but with jerky movements. He looked wrong, she later said. Descriptions lined up eerily well. White male, aged roughly 30-40, medium build, approximately 5'10", dark, collar-length hair, possibly unkempt, wearing dark trousers and a light jacket or top. But here's the part that raised every eyebrow in the incident room. One of the witnesses said the man's hands looked red, like they'd been bloodied or cut. She couldn't say for sure in the dim light, but she remembered it enough to mention it, even weeks later. Police mapped every sighting across a timeline. The man's movement seemed to start from near the field where Kate's body was later found, then led away from Exwick Lane, cutting through footpaths and side roads. This wasn't a jogger. He had no dog, no athletic gear. He wasn't someone out for an evening run. He was fleeing, and he wasn't alone. Just 10 minutes earlier, a blue vehicle, small, boxy, possibly a hatchback, had been seen idling in a lay-by further up the lane. A man was standing beside it, another inside. That car, which should have been easy to trace, never turned up again. It vanished without a trace. Investigators feared the worst. Was the car a getaway vehicle? Was this a planned abduction and murder, or had the killer acted alone and the car was just a coincidence? Despite repeated appeals, no one ever came forward to claim ownership of that vehicle. No one admitted to being in the area at that time. And as days turned into weeks, the Running Man became more than a witness. He became a suspect, a ghostly figure who may have slipped back into the town unnoticed. Detectives pursued every lead. They created an E-Fit composite based on witness input. It was circulated across the region and shown on Crimewatch, but not a single person came forward to identify him. Not one. Either he wasn't from Exeter, or worse, he was, and people were protecting him. What made this all the more chilling was the timing. Kate's estimated time of death was between 4:45 and 5:10 p.m. The Running Man was first sighted around 5:15. It was too close to ignore. Kate was walking the dog when she either saw something or someone saw her. There was no sign of a struggle, no scream, no warning. The attack had been swift and silent. Experts later speculated the killer may have grabbed her from behind, slitting her throat in a single motion before dragging her body off the path and into the grass. The knife used was long, sharp, and handled with a kind of grim precision. The kind of weapon and the kind of strike that suggested experience. Was the Running Man the killer, or had he stumbled onto something and fled in fear? To this day, no one knows, because he never came forward, and that silence spoke volumes. The crime scene was clean, too clean. Kate Bushell had been murdered in a secluded field just off Exwick Lane, but there were no bloody footprints, no discarded weapon, no DNA left behind that could be linked to anyone. Whoever had done this had vanished without a trace, leaving nothing. As forensic officers worked deep into the night under floodlights, carefully brushing through blades of grass and sifting mud by hand, they found something. It wasn't much at first, just a few bright orange threads clinging to Kate's clothing. But as the search widened, more of them appeared. In total, over 100 orange-dyed fibers were recovered from her fleece, her trousers, and around the wooden stile where her body was believed to have been dragged or propped. The fibers were tiny, some just millimeters long, but they were also distinctive. Forensic analysis determined they were azoic-dyed fibers, synthetic and unnaturally bright, the kind typically used in industrial or commercial workwear, high-visibility boiler suits, overalls, or gloves. These weren't the kinds of clothes an ordinary person wore on a casual walk through Devon. And so the theory shifted. Was her killer wearing a uniform? Was he someone who worked with his hands, maybe a mechanic, a contractor, a delivery driver? Investigators launched one of the largest forensic cross-checks in Devon and Cornwall's history. Dozens of local businesses were contacted, laundromats, garages, council works departments. Thousands of uniforms were compared to the fiber samples. But the match, the exact source of those fibers, remained elusive. The fibers weren't the only clue. Kate's injury was precise, a single deep cut across her throat with no defensive wounds. Pathologists concluded it had likely been inflicted from behind, possibly while the attacker had one arm across her chest and the other drawing the blade across in one swift, clean motion. The blade used was estimated to be at least 6 inches long, sharp, and possibly single-edged. Not a penknife, not a kitchen blade, but something purposeful, maybe a butcher's knife, a hunter's tool, or a blade used by someone accustomed to controlling it. This wasn't an impulsive, frenzied attack. It was controlled, fast. Whoever did it had either done it before or had prepared to do it now. That led detectives to another chilling consideration. Was Kate the intended target, or just the opportunity? She had no known enemies, no dark secrets, no boyfriends, no feuds. She was a bright, happy schoolgirl walking a neighbor's dog in daylight. So what had made her a target? Some investigators began to wonder if the killer hadn't been waiting. Not necessarily for Kate, but for anyone, someone walking alone, someone small, someone vulnerable. And maybe he came prepared. The fibers, the knife, the silence of the crime, all pointed toward premeditation. Still, for all their science and searching, the case refused to break. Detectives had no fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon, and no eyewitness who saw the exact moment of the attack. All they had were the fibers, tiny orange threads that might one day tie a man to the crime. If only they could find the man. And somewhere in Exeter or beyond, he was still walking free. From the very beginning, detectives knew one thing. Kate's killer didn't just happen upon Exwick Lane. He chose it. It wasn't a main road or a shortcut for passing traffic. It wasn't even easy to find unless you lived nearby. Tucked behind quiet homes and flanked by overgrown hedges, Exwick Lane was a dead-end path to most, used only by dog walkers, joggers, and the occasional cyclist. And yet, someone had waited there, hidden among the trees or tucked in a car, possibly watching Kate walk by with the dog. That much was clear. But the most chilling part, no one heard a thing. Police began mapping every house, every vantage point, every footpath around the area. The scene of the crime was visible from some back gardens. There were homes just a couple 100 feet away. Someone should have heard a scream, a cry, a struggle, but nothing. That told investigators something crucial. The killer struck fast, and he struck with confidence. He had chosen a blind spot, an area with just enough tree cover to hide what he was about to do. So they started asking new questions. Who knew the area well enough to know when and where to strike? Who was local, familiar with the dog-walking routines of the neighborhood? Who had reason to be in the field that day, but never came forward? The answer was haunting. It could have been anyone. A tradesman, a council worker, a man in his 30s or 40s, someone who blended in with the town, someone whose face you might pass in the shop queue or see walking down the road with a bag of tools. Exeter wasn't a massive city. It was a town with roots, a town where neighbors nodded to each other and knew who lived on which street. And yet, no one knew who killed Kate. In the days that followed, police began conducting house-to-house interviews. Over 5,000 homes were visited. At one point, They took DNA samples from more than 5,000 men in the region, postal workers, builders, groundskeepers, farmers, even clergy. The message was clear: the killer lived here, but he didn't come forward. He didn't flinch when the posters went up. He didn't stumble when his street was searched. He didn't say a word when the police cars lined the road and TV crews knocked on neighbors' doors. Because he didn't need to. He knew that with no DNA match, no murder weapon, and no witnesses to the actual attack, he could vanish in plain sight. And so he did. But as the case grew colder, the public's fear turned to quiet suspicion. Some claimed to know names. A few whispered about local men with violent pasts. One woman even reported a former boyfriend who had a habit of walking the exact path Kate took that day, alone with a blade in his belt. Police investigated every lead. Some were ruled out, others were never quite dismissed. Still, they couldn't prove anything. So the town waited, hoped, watched, and behind closed doors, a darker fear grew. By early 1998, the investigation into the murder of Kate Bushell had ballooned into one of the largest manhunts in Devon's history. The public had rallied behind the family, Crimewatch had featured the case, and posters lined shop windows across Exeter. But behind the scenes, detectives were beginning to feel the weight of a chilling reality. They had no suspect, and no physical evidence to tie anyone to the scene. No fingerprints, no footprints, no blood, no sweat, no hair, nothing. There was one chance left: DNA. Forensic science was advancing rapidly in the late 1990s. Cold cases were starting to be solved by microscopic traces. A single hair follicle could put a man behind bars. A drop of sweat could make or break an alibi. So they sent everything to the lab. Kate's clothes, the dog's lead, soil from the field, even leaves from nearby hedges. If the killer had so much as exhaled near the body, they'd try to catch it. Then the police launched what became known as a mass DNA screening, the largest of its kind in the region. Over the next year, detectives collected more than 5,000 voluntary DNA samples from men in Exeter and the surrounding villages. Builders, farmers, caretakers, every man who had reason to be near Exwick Lane that day, or who matched even part of the witness descriptions, was swabbed. The process was laborious. Interviews, consent forms, cotton swabs, lab testing, cross-referencing. Forensics worked overtime, every technician combing over the samples, hoping to find even a partial match. But test after test came back the same. No match. Then came the blow no one saw coming: a forensics error. In 1999, investigators learned that purple fibers had been found on Kate's clothing, but those fibers weren't from the crime scene. They were traced back to a lab technician's clothing, accidentally transferred during evidence handling. It was a mistake, one that didn't affect the original orange fiber evidence, but still it cast a long, cold shadow over the forensics process. People started asking questions. Was the investigation being mishandled? Had crucial evidence been lost? Had the killer slipped through their fingers already? Despite reassurances from detectives that Kate's case was still open, public confidence began to erode. The press grew quieter. The tips slowed. Some families refused DNA tests. Others simply disappeared from the radar. The wave of urgency that had powered the investigation began to settle into something darker: stalemate. The lead detective at the time admitted they were frustrated. "We've ruled out hundreds of men," he said, "but we only need one. Just one." But years passed. By the early 2000s, the case had grown cold. New crimes took precedence. New victims, new headlines. And yet every officer who had worked on the Bushell case knew it wasn't over. Because cases like this don't go away. They just wait, in files, in freezers, in memories, and maybe in the DNA of a man still walking free. Because if Kate's killer had been careful, if he hadn't bled, hadn't sweated, hadn't left so much as a skin cell behind, then all the science in the world couldn't catch him. Not yet. By the spring of 1998, months had passed since the murder of Kate Bushell, and the case had begun to slip from the front pages. But behind closed doors, detectives were planning something bigger, something that could pierce the silence that had swallowed their investigation. They turned to the one tool left in their arsenal, Crimewatch. For nearly 15 years, the BBC's Crimewatch program had been broadcasting reenactments of unsolved crimes to millions of viewers across the UK. It had helped catch murderers, rapists, and robbers. Police hoped that with the right appeal, Kate's story might finally reach the one person who could break it open. In May 1998, 6 months after Kate's murder, viewers across the country sat down to watch. What they saw was haunting. The reenactment opened with a young actress walking a small white dog down a quiet lane in Devon, a familiar walk, a peaceful afternoon, the same time, the same path, the same dog. Then came the voiceover. At 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, November 15th, 14-year-old Kate Bushell left her house to walk her neighbor's dog. She never came home. The screen showed police at the field, the crime scene markers, the cordoned-off stile. Her school photo flashed next, smiling, innocent, forever 14. Then the appeal began in earnest. Detectives outlined their key questions. Who was the man seen near the blue car in the lay-by that evening? Who was the running man seen fleeing the area around 5:15 p.m.? And who owned the small blue vehicle, possibly a hatchback, that disappeared without a trace? They released a composite sketch, a rough but recognizable face, a white male, mid-30s to 40s, medium build, shoulder-length dark hair, someone who looked like anyone, or everyone. As the program ended, the phone lines lit up. Within minutes, over 80 calls came in. Tips, names. I remember a man who used to walk that lane. There was someone parked in a car near the field last week. My neighbor fits that description. A handful of calls were marked as high priority. Detectives followed them quickly. Interviews were arranged, houses searched, but again, nothing stuck. The most promising tip involved a man who reportedly had an obsession with young girls and was known to carry a knife. He had even lived near Exwick. But he denied everything. No evidence tied him to Kate, no DNA, no fibers, no confession. The public appeal had rattled the cage, but the killer didn't step forward. He didn't call to taunt or threaten. He didn't run. And if he watched Crimewatch that night, and police believe he did, he simply sat there, in silence. Still, the episode wasn't a failure. The case remained in the public eye. Kate's story now belonged to more than just a town. It belonged to a country, and that meant someone, somewhere, might still hold the missing piece, a memory, a conversation, a name. But the weeks dragged on, and the phones went quiet. The trail cooled once more, and the detective leading the case, standing in front of the press one rainy afternoon, admitted what everyone feared. We are no closer to identifying the man who murdered Kate Bushell. The eyes of the nation had looked into the dark corners of Exwick Lane. But still, the killer stayed hidden. Somewhere in that silence he was listening. Somewhere in that town he was watching. And still, he said nothing. As the years crept by, the horror of Kate Bushell's murder never truly faded, but it did begin to quiet. The case that once commanded headlines, Crimewatch specials, and nightly appeals slowly slipped from the national spotlight. Families moved in and out of Exwick. Children grew up and left. The lane that had once been taped off and crawling with forensic teams became once again just a place to walk the dog. But for Kate's family, her parents, Graham and Suzanne, and her brother Tim, time did not bring distance. There were birthdays missed, school photos never taken, teenage years never lived, a room left untouched, a voice never heard again. The pain never softened. It only learned to live in silence. By 2007, 10 years after the murder, the case remained officially open but inactive. The files were stacked in archives, evidence sealed, DNA stored and retested occasionally as forensic methods advanced. But no new leads had come in. No arrests had been made. In many homes across Exeter, the belief had taken hold. The killer had gotten away with it. But inside the Devon and Cornwall major crime team, the case never truly died. It was too personal, too brutal, too close. In 2017, on the 20th anniversary of Kate's murder, a decision was made. Detectives reopened the case with fresh eyes. Operation Deacon was launched, a full cold case review using modern technology, new investigative approaches, and a simple mission: re-examine everything and find who did this. A new team of officers was brought in, including forensic experts and behavioral analysts. Hundreds of original witness statements were reviewed. Over 200 exhibits of physical evidence were retested using modern DNA techniques. A fresh public appeal was launched. Crimewatch aired a new segment. A £10,000 reward was offered through Crime Stoppers. Detectives walked Exwick Lane again, in uniform and plain clothes. Local papers ran feature-length retrospectives. The Sun called it a haunting mystery that refuses to rest. And it worked. 204 calls came in from the public, some repeating old theories, but 10 of them were completely new. New names, new possibilities. One tip claimed a now-deceased man had confessed on his deathbed to hurting a girl near Exeter. Another caller described someone obsessed with the original news coverage who had lived nearby at the time and abruptly moved away shortly after Kate's death. Investigators pursued each lead, digging into cold files, speaking with neighbors now in their 50s and 60s. Surveillance photos from 1997 were reanalyzed using AI enhancement tools. A few more samples were swabbed, 1 or 2 properties were quietly visited, but in the end, no breakthrough, not yet. The silence, it seemed, had stretched too long. Memories had faded, people had died. If the killer was still alive, he had learned to vanish within the cracks of time, to walk quietly, to hide in plain sight, to be forgotten, but not by Kate's family. On November 15, 2017, at a memorial service held on a windswept hill near the place she died, Kate's mother, Suzanne, stood beside her son, now a grown man, and placed a single white lily on a memorial stone. "We still hope," she whispered, and as the wind rustled through the trees behind her, the weight of 20 years pressed down, not just on one family, but on a town still haunted by a field, a lane, and a question left unanswered: where is he now? In 1998, just 11 months after the murder of Kate Bushell, another woman was found dead in a remote field, her throat slashed in chillingly similar fashion. Her name was Lynn Bryant. She was 40 years old, a wife, a mother, and just like Kate, she was alone, walking in the daylight, when a killer came out of nowhere and silenced her forever. It happened on October 20th, 1998, in Ruan Highlands, a rural part of Cornwall nearly 100 miles from Exwick. Lynn had been out walking her dog along quiet country lanes she knew well. She was attacked in broad daylight, stabbed multiple times in the neck and back, and her body left near a field gate just meters from the road. It was brutal. It was sudden. And just like with Kate, there were no screams, no weapon, no suspects. At first, the 2 cases were investigated independently. Kate was 14, Lynn was 40, one in Devon, one in Cornwall. Different counties, different teams. But when detectives from both forces began quietly comparing notes, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Both were female and walking dogs alone in the countryside. Both were attacked in isolated lanes, surrounded by hedges and fields. In both cases, the killer left no trace, no weapon, no DNA, no clear motive. Both victims had no enemies, no personal ties to violence. And most chilling of all, both died from sharp force trauma to the neck, suggesting the use of a long, sharp blade, possibly the same kind of weapon. The police began to wonder, were they looking for the same man? Criminal profilers believed it was possible. This wasn't just about opportunity. It was about type. A killer who moved through rural spaces, who understood how to strike in silence, who waited until his victim was completely alone, who killed with efficiency, but also ritual. In 2000, the two cases were quietly linked under what investigators referred to internally as a potential series. Not enough evidence to say it was one man, but not enough differences to rule it out either. They even shared a fibre connection, though not definitively matching. Both scenes included fibers that pointed toward workwear, potentially from a man in a manual trade or utility work. There was also a theory that Lynn may have been followed by car, as Kate's killer may have used the blue vehicle seen near Exwick Lane. Detectives went back to the blue car sightings, wondering, could it have reappeared in Cornwall nearly a year later? Had the killer simply driven away from Devon and struck again? A forensic review in 2018 reignited that theory. When police reappealed to the public for both cases during their 20-year anniversaries, they didn't say it outright, but their messaging was clear. There may be a link, and if it is the same man, then he's killed before, and he could kill again. Despite this, no DNA link was ever found, no confession, no fingerprint. The killer had been clean, precise, efficient, but he had also made one mistake. He had done it more than once. That meant his chances of remaining invisible had just dropped. Because someone, somewhere, knew a man who was in Devon in 1997 and Cornwall in 1998. Someone had seen the knives, heard the violent thoughts, noticed the sudden mood swings, the interest in news coverage, the obsession with keeping a secret, and someone had stayed silent. To this day, the murders of Kate Bushell and Lynn Bryant remain two of the most harrowing unsolved killings in modern British history. But whether they were committed by one man or two, the result is the same: a family destroyed, a community haunted, and a killer who walked away without looking back. In the years following Kate Bushell's murder and the eerily similar killing of Lynn Bryant, detectives began consulting with criminal profilers, hoping to understand not just who the killer was, but why he killed. Because this wasn't a robbery, it wasn't random, it was planned, controlled, executed in near silence. Kate had no known enemies, no dark secrets. She wasn't caught up in drugs, gangs, or danger. She was a 14-year-old girl walking a neighbor's dog in daylight. So the question burned deeper than ever. What kind of person murders a child like that, with such precision and without hesitation? The answer from the psychologists was cold and clinical. You're looking for a predator, a fantasist, a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind before the blade was ever in his hand. This man, they said, didn't kill on impulse. He killed with purpose. He likely had violent fantasies for years, perhaps beginning in adolescence. He may have started by stalking women or girls, following from a distance, learning routines. Possibly he had tested boundaries, peering into windows, brushing past victims in shops, or experimenting with cruelty toward animals. But Kate's murder marked a shift. It was an escalation. Not a first act, but the one he couldn't hold back anymore. He may have stalked her beforehand. Not necessarily Kate herself, but the path, the routine, the type. A girl alone, a dog walker, a lane where no one would hear. When the opportunity came, he was ready. And afterwards, he would have been calm. One profiler noted something chilling. This man wouldn't have gone home in a panic. He would have washed the blade, cleaned his clothes, and carried on. He would have watched the news coverage, possibly obsessively. He might have even returned to the scene, days later, to watch. He likely lived locally, or knew Exwick well. He may have worked in a trade, a job that gave him freedom to move around unnoticed. Builders, groundskeepers, utility workers, gardeners, someone whose high-vis jacket and parked van wouldn't raise alarm. He may have moved shortly after the murder. That detail stuck with police. how some individuals simply disappeared from the neighborhood in the months following Kate's death. Some changed jobs. One or two left the country entirely. None were ever conclusively linked. But the timing was too precise to ignore. What disturbed police most was that the killer had left no signature, no mark of rage or emotion. No overkill. No calling card. It was what profilers called a controlled kill. He wanted it fast, clean, efficient, and that in itself said everything. This was someone capable of blending in. Someone who could sit across from his family at dinner, laugh at the pub, wave to a neighbor, and be carrying the memory of a girl's final breath with complete detachment. But there was one hope. Profilers believed that he hadn't stopped, that someone capable of this kind of attack wouldn't simply end with one victim. Even if no other murders were tied to him directly, they believed the man responsible may have shown patterns elsewhere, crimes just below the radar. Knife threats, petty assaults, break-ins, voyeurism, and maybe, just maybe, one of those old charges somewhere in a dusty file in some other police station held a DNA sample, one they hadn't tested yet, one that could still, after all this time, connect the dots between a silent man on a country lane and the girl he left bleeding in the grass. Because as psychologists warned, this kind of killer doesn't forget what he did. He replays it, and he's never as far away as we think. Over 2 decades had passed since Kate Bushell was murdered on that quiet Devon Lane, and still her killer had not been named, not charged, not brought to justice. But detectives never stopped watching. With every new development in forensic science, every improvement in DNA analysis, fibre mapping, or cold case algorithms, Kate's evidence was re-examined, again and again, because all it would take is one hit, one overlooked clue, one new name whispered into the phone at just the right moment. That hope is why the appeals have never stopped. Even now, nearly 30 years later, the major crime investigation team keeps Kate's file active. The tip lines remain open. And every few years, there is a fresh push. A renewed call to the public, to the neighbors who were there in 1997, to the workers who passed through Exwick, to the families who may have heard a disturbing confession, even in half words or nervous laughter, because they know something is still out there. Maybe it's a woman who dated a man with a strange fascination for violent news stories. Maybe it's a former friend who remembers an offhand comment made in a pub decades ago. Maybe it's someone who recognizes that blue car seen idling in the lay-by that day. Maybe it's the owner of the orange overalls who never explained where they disappeared to. Or maybe it's him, still watching, still silent, but getting older, slipping, making mistakes. In 2024, police issued yet another nationwide appeal. The reward was raised to £20,000. New forensic screenings were ordered. The crime scene was digitally reconstructed using satellite data from 1997. Officers even began reaching out to family members of deceased suspects to gather indirect DNA, hoping to find a familial match. Because time changes things. Where once the killer had friends willing to lie for him, those friends are now older, tired, perhaps ready to tell the truth. Where once people were too scared to speak, they're now thinking of legacy, of morality. Where once the killer was cautious, now maybe he's careless. Investigators believe he's still alive, and even if he's not, someone still knows who he was. It's why the phones remain open, why the posters still go up, why Kate's photo still stares out from press releases with that same soft smile. Because it only takes one phone call, one anonymous message, one person who says, "It's been long enough." And when that call comes, and it will, the silence that has surrounded Kate Bushell's death for almost 3 decades will finally crack. And in that crack, a name will emerge, a face, a story, and finally, justice. Kate Bushell was just 14 years old, a bright, kind-hearted girl with her whole life ahead of her, taken in a moment of unimaginable cruelty. Her family has lived with that silence ever since. No answers, no justice, no peace. This story is more than a mystery. It is a wound that has never healed, for her parents, for her brother, and for a community that still remembers the sound of police sirens on Exwick Lane. If you know something, anything at all, it is not too late to come forward. Even the smallest detail could be the missing piece. If you have any information, please contact Devon and Cornwall Police on 101 and quote crime reference number EN/3978/97. You can also speak anonymously via Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. Let Kate's story be more than a cold case. Let it be the reason someone finally speaks. Let it be the reason a family can finally begin to heal.